when that Big Ben clock strikes 11 o'clock on the 31st of December, approximately 19 days from today. Two things, depending what state you find yourself in. If you've drunk too much orange juice or too much alternative imbibement, then you've got an hour to go before a brave new year kicks in. We're all going to say goodbye to 2020 with mixed feelings, probably mostly not with much regret, and we're glad it's out the way. But also, that's the official timing when we, as the UK, and I'm talking Scotland, England and Wales, officially, after 47 years of wedlock, leave the EU. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Mahmood. I'm an accountant by qualification experience, educated mentor, love the world of business, whether that's private business, not-for-profit business, and all through this year and previous years, in my 26 years of business life, I've been helping and supporting businesses cut through the noise, cut through all the different things that have thrown us business owners, all the different changes. 2020 has certainly been quite a year, hasn't it, in terms of the C word, the F word. I'm not being rude here. We're talking about coronavirus, furloughing, grants, rules, regulations, lockdown, tears. And the clock has been ticking for a couple of years now, because 2016, when the official referendum was finished, we announced Brexit, and it comes around very quickly. And in literally under 3 weeks' time, officially, that's it. We have officially left the EU. And what's, I think, to a large extent slipped under the radar, there's been a lot more noise being made certainly in the last few weeks here, is that suddenly Brexit is on top of the agenda. And I thought when I was putting this broadcast together, that, you know what, there's a lot of clients that I talk to, there's a lot of businesses that I talk to. We are aware in the background Brexit has been pushed back. You know, we're hearing conversations about fishing. We're hearing conversations about political allegiances, a whole backlog. And I think what's been left out is that businesses, SMEs, aren't actually quite sure what's going on. So even though there's lots of, in theory, information published on government websites, the reality of this is, in our business lives, is we don't always connect with what's going on in some government website, some government advertising. We're busy trying to keep coping with what's being thrown at us here. So for me, I just thought it'd be appropriate. I've published some blogs on the topic, which I'll reference at the end of it, is to say, look, from a practical perspective, it's going to happen. This is the things that you need to be aware of, and to actually make connections and do things now. So there is still time to do some things. Some things we can't do yet, by the way, because we can't officially do them until the 1st of January, which is a bit rubbish. But effectively, this today is to trawl up the awareness of we need to connect with as business owners, and what we can get sorted. You may think, by the way, oh, Europe's nothing to do with me, I have no connection. You will be sadly mistaken, by the way. After a 47-year marriage and a separation, which is part amicable, part acrimonious, on the 1st of January 2021, it's formed such an intrinsic part of our lives. We've got generations who literally know nothing else except the EU, and our lives will change to some extent. Bonjour, my French pronunciation is quite poor. Good friend of mine and client, bonjour, Nadine, ça va? I'm not going to embarrass myself by doing anything beyond that, because it will be quite laughable. So really looking forward to your company today, Nadine. I know we've mentioned Brexit before. So in this broadcast, let me just bring in the power of my screen share. So the title of today's topic is Your UK Business, and I've just noticed a spelling mistake on the slide, just to show you that I actually put this program together this morning, and you can tell that proofreading skill is not my forte. So that should be Your UK Business in a post-Brexit world. What are we going to look at today? Now, there are Q&As, by the way, so by all means, as we go through, if you've got any questions that get thrown in, you want to ask me, by all means, throw them in. I'll do my level best to actually answer them. Now, I know on some things I'm pretty clued up, on some things I'm pretty knowledgeable and expert on, and other areas I'm aware of them, and other areas just go over my head. I don't think one single person knows all the answers to Brexit. I think there's a lot of questions still out there that haven't been answered. What I'm trying to do today is to focus on the headlines, the bits that you need to be aware of, certainly. And I'm going to benchmark you to go to other places to dig out information. Some areas like VAT, some areas like in terms of business relationships with Europe, that I'll give you a more detailed exposition. And there's some goodies I'm going to announce at the end of the broadcast. That's a fantastic point there. It's a challenge, I think, to work out the implications of Brexit in business at work. So let me read out the question. How do I know? Good morning to you, or good afternoon now. I've been trying to work out the implications of Brexit in the business I work out. Having read online, got some consultants' help, I conclude we're not ready and things will be different from January. Absolutely. And look, businesses out there, myself included, before you beat yourself up and think, my gosh, I haven't got all this ready, what typically happens is, if I look at something like Making Tax Digital, which was introduced a few years ago, well, effectively April 2019, that has not been fully implemented and embraced by all organisations. Now, that's something that got a lot more government initiatives behind it, a lot more government effective. We didn't have a COVID scenario going at that time. If I look at things like auto-enrolment, as it's called, where you have to operate a payroll scheme if you've got an employee, that hasn't been fully embraced by all businesses. Lots of businesses aren't still aware. So don't beat yourself up. Effectively, what we're going to try and do today is to give you some degree of comfort, some degree of relaxation, and you can think, okay, Mahmood's given us some really good insights here. This is what I need to do next. And also, remember, if you're not quite sure of the answers, I will benchmark some agencies that you can go to. Obviously, talk to your own accounting team, your own accountants. I'll give accountants some credit here who've been coping with things like coronavirus. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. So, people's in-trays have been flooded with lots of things. But again, this is not going to disappear. So get yourself sorted and don't feel bad if you've not addressed it at the moment. Nothing's ever too late. So what are we going to cover as far as today's session is concerned? So for me, I'm going to cover really 4 brackets 5 broad areas. So I'm going to look at GDPR. Now, GDPR, the reason I'm looking at it is because when it was introduced into the UK, it's actually an EU initiative. So it's looking at the looking after of personal data, mostly in relation to individuals and also impacts on business that you have dealing with. The UK have enshrined that into UK data protection legislation, but fundamentally, the body of the legislation in the UK is an EU-driven initiative. Now, the UK government have actually said that after Brexit, on the 1st of January 2021, for all sense and purposes, they are largely going to keep the principles of GDPR as they are in the current data protection legislation. There will be some modifications, and you might think, we're now outside the EU, we can say goodbye to the EU. Remember, though, if you're transmitting data, you're dealing with the EU, of which there are 27 countries, then you need to comply with the EU version of GDPR. So if you've got any data being transmitted, you've got databases, communications going either into EU or EU coming to you, you need to be aware and you need to comply with those provisions. If you don't, then obviously you run the risk of your business not being able to continue in that particular region. Also, if you do operate in that manner without the appropriate guidance, without the appropriate cover, then you run the risk of being prosecuted, financially punished, and obviously that's not something we want for your businesses. In terms of as a point of reference, it's not my area of expertise. I'm fully aware that it's there. I'm fully aware of EU is the underpinning legislation for GDPR. Then I would suggest that you check out the ICO, which is called the Information Commissioner's Office. There's a beautiful website there. They're the head honcho for all things GDPR. Obviously, if you've got a GDPR person that you work with, then I would suggest if they haven't approached you already, then have that conversation with them. I will publish the links at the end of the broadcast, but be aware also, at the end, I'll give you the reference to my website. Well, it's there already, isn't it? So if you go on to proactiveresolutions.com, go to the news section and the podcast, and we've already got 2 published blogs on there in the last few weeks and podcasts on the Brexit, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and that in a post-Brexit world. So again, they contain some links to external agencies, as well as, by all means, happy if you want to contact us. Now, EU settlement. If you've got somebody who works with you or works in your business, or yourself, if you're an EU national, then if you want to carry on residing in the United Kingdom, then you've got to have what's called EU settlement arrangements. And you've got until 30th of June 2021, by the way, to register that accordingly. Now, it can be a complex situation. There are already established systems there to help guide you through the process. But again, if you're an EU national and you want to continue residing in the United Kingdom, then you must make sure you register by the 30th of June 2021. In addition, bear in mind, you could have people coming to work with you. So you're going to have to obviously make sure that you comply and you're aware of what those regulations are. Again, it's not my direct level of expertise, but it's be amazing how many people are actually using EU nationals that might work as part of their fabric for quite a number of years here. So we need to make sure that nothing untoward is going to happen. I want to say at this point, by the way, if you're thinking, my gosh, Mahmood, there's quite a lot to actually get to grips with. There's quite a lot that, that's going to overwhelm us. What I would say is that even though we've been part of the EU since the 1st of January 1973, 47-year history behind us, and fundamentally a lot of legislation, a lot of what we do, a lot of things that govern, for example, VAT, which I'm going to talk about later on, largely the actual acting of it, the principles that underpin those procedures and processes will remain the same. What you're going to largely see a change in is the relationship between us and the EU. I'll explain that in a few seconds. In addition, the underlying principles will change, but there will be different forms, different procedures. There will be some heavy work involved in making sure for example, your computing systems are up to speed, making sure your data capture systems are up to speed. When we talk about goods and services, there's going to be a sea change in terms of the operating procedures, in terms of what we have to do there. There will be some investments of resources and knowledge and expertise and technology to actually comply. For some things, there is what's called a bedding in period. So some things have been delayed, deferred. Not too long, by the way, it's only about 6 months, but some things will kick in straight away. So even though it sounds overwhelming, I'm going to suggest at the end of this broadcast what my next steps would be if I hadn't been fully prepared or aware what the EU relationship will be like with the United Kingdom. In this broadcast, we're going to look at goods and services. So if your business sells goods and or services into the EU, unfortunately, there's going to be different procedures, different ways way of working. I'll explain what those are. And lastly, VAT. Now, VAT is, when I say it's an optional tax, VAT was introduced into the UK when we joined the EU in 1973. In theory, the UK could abolish VAT overnight. The UK will have its own sovereignty. It can, in theory, wave a magic wand and say goodbye VAT. Well, you've got about as much chance of that happening as Elvis being spotted on the checkout of Marks and Spencer's or Tesco's. It generates about £140 billion a year for the UK exchequer. It generates about 21% of the UK tax revenue. The UK government have also said they're not going to get rid of VAT, so don't expect any change there. Now, one thing I love about the people who jump on the broadcast, they share information with me that I may not have been aware of. So let me just read out Nadine's excellent point here. Thank you for that correction, Nadine. So you don't register for EU settlement, you apply for it and upload documents as evidence, and then they say yes or no and provide more evidence. I was required to provide a lot of extra documents. Nadine, I hope you don't mind mentioning. Nadine, as you probably saw from the introduction, is from France. So again, thank you very much for clarifying that. I should point out that's not my area of expertise, so that's great. So it looks relatively straightforward. However, as Nadine's made an excellent point here, make sure you've got the documentation. And I think preparation for these things, the actual form filling itself isn't necessarily the battle, but it's actually making sure you collate and get all the documentary evidence that you need for when you actually submit that application process. So I think very useful. I would imagine different countries in the EU will have different ways of doing this as well. Perfect. A couple of other things just to bear in mind, everybody. In terms of when we look at the next two elements here, let's bring this on. Now let's look at the goods. So this is where your business is selling goods into the EU. Now it's quite, I wouldn't call it amusing. When I looked on the European Union website, which obviously that's one of the things I would be doing, it's quite interesting to note that even though officially the UK doesn't leave the EU until 11 p.m. on the 31st of December 2020, we've been removed already, and we being the UK, we've already been removed from the list of EU countries, and this was done some weeks ago. So as far as the EU are concerned, it's goodbye United Kingdom. We're no longer part of the EU, but even though officially we're still married, we're still in that relationship with them until the 31st of December 2020. No arguments of who gets the crockery, how the furniture is divided up at this stage, but effectively 27 countries still remain in there. And what we've got to remember is, at this moment in time, if I sell goods outside the EU, they are classified as exports. If goods come into my business, come into the UK from one of those non-EU countries at the moment, they are classified as imports. Seems quite straightforward, doesn't it? At the moment, any goods that come in and out of the EU, between the UK and the EU, are actually not called imports or exports, which from a general conversational point of view seems quite a bizarre way. But in terms of trade, in terms of duties, in terms of VAT, goods flowing in and out of EU at the moment are not considered exports or imports. They're considered, and it's a bit of a weird phrase, Intra EU Acquisitions. What does that mean? Well, basically what that means is they flow in and out of the EU, including coming into the UK and leaving the UK, as what's called free movement of goods. So therefore no duties apply, no tariffs apply, and the customs procedures are largely non-existent. However, when we get to the 31st of December 2020, 11 p.m, after that point in time, we're no longer an EU member, and therefore we are viewed as what's called a third country. So to some extent, this simplifies that, even though there might be a bit of a migration on the getting your head around this, is that UK will view any goods going into the 27 EU countries as exports, and any goods coming into the UK from pretty much any country, EU included, as imports. Straight away, what that means is, in terms of that change of trading status, is there's paperwork and forms that will continue. So when goods come in and out of the UK, there are going to be more customs forms, more customs controls. Goods arriving into the United Kingdom from the EU, and obviously that's what we're focusing on, will have customs declarations to complete. Potentially there'll be duties and tariffs to pay as well. Currently, you also have got to complete documentation and assign what's called a tariff code to each of the goods that come in. There are approximately 15,000, by the way. You won't obviously have to memorize all 15,000. That'll be quite a memory test, but you need to make sure that when the goods come in, you assign the appropriate tariff code, the customs code. The UK will have its own new one that's already published on the 1st of January. And therefore, there's going to be a lot more bureaucracy that will occur as a result. So again, if it's new to you, what a lot of companies are doing at the moment, they are using what they call customs agents or freight forwarding agents who are specialised in there. They can carry out these responsibilities on your behalf. What you should weigh up there is, do you have the technology? Do you have the infrastructure? Do you have the time to learn all the customs procedures? If you do, fantastic. If you don't, then in the short term, you may want to access the expert help of a freight forwarding agent, a customs agent who will make you aware of this. Obviously, remember what this is going to do, though. This is going to affect the documentation that's going to be done. It's going to affect the costing. It's going to affect your systems. So even though somebody might do that on your behalf, you as the business are still largely responsible for this. So there will be more customs controls. Let me just pause there for a second. What I'm going to do, ladies and gentlemen, as we go through this here, is to flag up questions as they arrive. So let me read this question out. I'll give you a general answer on this, Rajesh, and then if you need me, we can pick up the dialogue later on. So, Morning Mahmood, it says here for those people who are not seeing the questions, I need some clarification of how trade with Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland will work, and what system changes we need to make for our customers, vendors, and what their VAT status would be. Okay, perfect. Let me give you a general answer to that one. And again, I'll give you some specific guidance, some links and references. Now, Northern Ireland is still, because of historical sort of peace agreements and all the rest of it, will still be considered as part of effectively an EU country for trading purposes. So in terms of depending goods flowing in and out of Northern Ireland, as far as that's concerned, the conversations that are going at the moment, yet to be clarified, is there's going to be minimal in terms of paperwork, there's going to be minimal procedures that are going on. What I would say though, and it's frustrating for lots of businesses, the devil of the detail has not yet been clarified as far as Northern Ireland is concerned. I specifically excluded Northern Ireland from the conversation about the UK, by the way, because Northern Ireland at the moment is still being treated to a large extent as part of the EU. And therefore, if you imagine that, if we're dispatching goods to Northern Ireland and vice versa, they're not necessarily going to be imports and exports, they're largely going to be EU transactions as far as the EU is concerned. So that's one thing. Southern Ireland, by the way, and I'm going to mention this later on when we talk about VAT in more detail, is an EU country in its own right. So therefore, any trade between the UK and Southern Ireland will be treated effectively as trading as an export, as an import accordingly. So Rajesh, I don't know if that answers your general question. The other points you were, what system changes do you make? Well, you need to effectively think in terms of the invoicing systems that you set up. I am going to suggest again a couple of modifications that you can do. So there's going to be a lot more what I call data capture. There's going to be a lot more in terms of understanding who your customers are. There's going to be a lot more in terms of understanding where your customers are located. And therefore, especially if we're moving more and more into this digital world here, we need to make sure our systems are configured. If we don't comply, by the way, there will be financial consequences, fines, and potentially there's an impact on your marketplace as well. But again, I'm just going to give you a heads up, some thoughts at the end of this broadcast. Just to flag up as well, by the way, I am doing a webinar next Friday. I'll mention it now here, specifically looking at digital services being sold into the EU. Effectively, what happens, how do we do that? And as a practical guide here, I'll publish some details at the end of this broadcast. Absolutely, Nadine. So Nadine's asked again, great questions coming through here. Will Xero change anything when I set up invoices for an EU customer? Yeah, in theory, Xero should announce the changes soon, but the status will change. So it won't be an EU customer anymore. And Nadine, because I obviously know Nadine well, will be selling services into the EU. And again, depending on the nature of the services provided, will determine how the VAT treatment applies. So yes, there will be some different codings. In the business that I run an accounting firm as well as a training company. We have lots of clients who use digital platforms, who use digital cloud accounting software. And as a small aside, by the way, it's the way to go. Therefore, a lot of the chart of accounts, a lot of the VAT codes that are being already in existence will have to be modified to deal with effectively the EU from the 31st of December 2020 onwards. So obviously clients of ours will be informed of these changes. So Nadine, the answer in principle, how you do the invoicing is yes. It should be just selecting the appropriate code when you actually do your invoicing itself. So hopefully that's been useful. Now, EORI, it stands for an economic operator's license. So licensing will come in. So if you are importing or exporting goods after 31st of December 2020, you will need an operator's license. Okay, this is not, oh, I might get one. You need one. If you don't, you run the risk of goods being slowed down at customs while you get the clearance and control. So effectively, you do need an operator's license. Now, the actual application process, by the way, is relatively, I'm talking relative here, light touch. So if you're already VAT registered, you may find that the Xero number can link to your VAT number. If you're not already registered and you don't have an operator's license, do it now. The procedure I would suggest, if you get all your data collected, and there's about 2 or 3 variations, by the way, should take about half an hour to an hour once you've got your data assembled. But bear in mind where we are now. We are, he says, quickly looking at his clock, the 12th of December, and it can take up to a week. I would factor in, because I think there's something called Christmas coming up soon, factor in a few days. So after this broadcast, I would suggest if you are importing or exporting goods, so remember, after the end of December 2020, goods coming in from the EU will now be classified as imports. Goods going into the EU will now be classified as exports, and you need an operator's license. The license, by the way, is not like a physical, like an HGV license. It's effectively something that uses to track the shipment of goods in and out of the UK. Remember, Customs and HMRC will keep a careful eye on this here, because if any tariffs are due, they want to make sure they're collected. They want to minimise the level of fraud that goes on. So again, apply for it. It can take up to about 7 days to actually get one. Now, duty deferment. We don't actually know the full list of which goods coming in from the EU will be tariff-free. Those conversations are going on at the moment. Last time when I listened to the radio this morning, we're still talking fishing. Fishing is always a strange thing for me, because in terms of economic terms, then what you'll find is that fishing accounts for about 0.1% of GDP for the UK. I think it's about 760 odd million pounds, compared to financial services, which is about 132 billion euros. Effectively, the magnitude is completely different, but it's got a political statement. Obviously, a lot of places in the UK that are fishing villages have got large amounts of employment. So, but effectively, it's dominating the headlines, and I think these other things are slipping under the radar. One thing that I've, just a piece of observation here for you when it comes to fishing, is that most of the fish that the UK fishing companies catch is actually exported, believe it or not, into the EU. Most of the fish that we consume in the UK is actually imported. So obviously goods, tariffs, movements here is going to be a big issue. Ironically, by the way, over half of the UK fishing fleet is actually owned by overseas companies. But, you know, that's just a bit I'm going to throw in. Yes, you will do. So if you're selling physical notebooks here, Nadine, and dispatching them, as far as I'm aware, you will need a license to actually do that. So don't think it's just heavy industrial machinery. It's for any importing or exporting of goods. You will need a license to track accordingly. Doesn't mean you owe anything, by the way, on those products, but you do need to have a license set up here. I'll double check that as well, Nadine, after this broadcast here. But again, for my reading of the legislation and the guidance notes, if you deal with importing and exporting of goods, you need a license. Now, if you're importing goods from the EU, by the way, it's likely there will be some duties that might be owed. There'll be some tariffs potentially. We're now covered by the UK tariff system. And also potentially VAT will be due on those imports as well. Now, traditionally, when goods are imported into the UK, they go into what's called a customs warehouse, and until you pay the VAT, those goods stay in that customs warehouse, so you can't actually get hold of them. What the UK government have said is we will operate what's called two things here, a duty deferment scheme, and there's also something called postponed accounting for VAT. Now, let me talk about the duty deferment. To avoid that big, massive cash outflow where you have to pay the duty on importation at point of import, you can apply for a duty deferment account. You pay your duty on a monthly basis by direct debit. Also, assuming your tax record is up to date, assuming you're compliant, then you also do not have to provide a guarantee for duty. So there's a waiver on the guarantee scheme for importation. But again, Some businesses may not be eligible. So again, what you need to do is, if you want to minimize the cash flow impact, then you need to apply for a duty deferment account. Again, log on to our friends at HMRC, application processes there, and make sure you do that. Now, when it comes to VAT, as I said, normally when goods are imported into the UK, VAT is paid normally before those goods can leave a customs warehouse. Normally there's a form called a C79 to show my really sort of anal knowledge there. And until you pay those goods, the VAT on those goods, you can't get hold of them. Now, what the government have said is they're going to waive that, and you're going to account for that VAT on your VAT return. So there's no cash outflow or inflow. It's merely accounting entries. We're going to apply something called reverse charge on those goods that are coming in. So VAT is, what will happen is when you do your VAT return, you look at the goods, you account for the VAT that would be due on that normally. You also declare it as input VAT. So it's accounting entries only and not actual cash that changes hands. What will happen? I think Rajesh asked the question earlier on. Again, your accounting systems need to make sure that you can reflect that. So there is going to be an impact in the investment. And what I would always suggest in any situation is make sure your cash flows are up to date. So that's the VAT side of things. And now again, when we exporting goods, largely, I will say largely, by the way, when it comes to selling goods, once they leave the UK and they're going into the EU, they'll be known as exports. Northern Ireland has got a special status, flagged up earlier on. Again, the detail has not yet been ironed out. So we have to wait and see what's actually going to go on there as well. Now, as far as goods going out, largely the general rule still applies. So goods leaving the UK going into the EU or beyond are treated as outside of the scope of VAT. What that means is no VAT is charged on those goods. There are exceptions, as you would expect, but as a general rule, VAT is not charged on the export of those goods. They're outside of the scope of VAT. If you're not VAT registered already, by the way, in your business, so typically you might be under £85,000 worth of sales, you might think, great, I don't have to worry. You might not charge VAT, but remember, the value of those sales are still included as part of your turnover to determine whether you have to mandatory register for VAT. So typically, if my turnover is, say, £60,000 a year, I suddenly develop a marketplace in the EU for selling goods. The value of those goods go to 30,000. Well, when I add those two together, that's £90,000 worth of turnover, which means I have to register for VAT. The goods that I'm selling out into EU, remember, will now be considered exports. And therefore, I won't actually add VAT to those sales, but they still are included in my VAT return in the sales box. So no VAT charge, but you still include them as part of your turnover. So again, keep a careful eye on that. Make sure you don't go over the VAT threshold, or if you do, you make sure you notify HMRC accordingly. If you don't, by the way, you can guess what the consequences are. Basically, slap on the wrist, financial penalties, which obviously are avoidable. And you then enter that murky world of being an unpaid tax collector. There are exceptions, as I said, and I'm going to mention this on the next slide. Let's go over. Apologies, this is going over the normal half an hour, but I think it's an important topic we need to address. Now, the last, I suppose, major area I want to comment on today is on the treatment of services. So we dealt with goods. We're now going to look at it where we actually provide services. So we're a business and we're providing services. And again, I'm focusing on the EU. Now, there's an exception here. The general two main questions that you need to consider when you're selling items into the EU is either are you selling business to business or are you selling business to consumer? Now, the definition of business, certainly for what we call distance selling and digital services, does not have the same meaning as it does like, am I a sole trader? Am I a limited company? It means, is your customer VAT registered? If your customer is not VAT registered, then largely you're going to be dealing with them as a consumer. So that your end customer might be another sole trader, another limited company, maybe a charity. If they're not VAT registered, to a large extent, they're going to be treated as a consumer. Now, there's two things. The second thing we need to do is decide what was called a general place of supply rule. Now, let me explain what this means. If you are selling business to business, the VAT, i.e. who pays it, who has to account for it, is largely dealt with by your end customer. So if I'm selling goods to a VAT registered business in the EU, that's a business to business transaction. Okay, we've said already, after the 31st of December 2020, no VAT is charged on the export. Now, if I'm providing services, so somebody in France says, Mahmood, we've heard some great things about you. We want you to provide some services to us in France because we've heard you've done beautiful things. I'm going to say that's wonderful, or magnifique, if I'm going to try and speak the language. Now, if they're a VAT registered business in France, and I'm a VAT registered business in the UK, which I am, then effectively that's a business to business transaction, and they will do what's called reverse charging. They will account for the VAT on their VAT return as what's called output VAT. They also make a declaration for the same amount as input VAT. End of story. It's called reverse charge accounting, and that's what they do. That's the general rule. Now, if you're selling effectively services, which are called digital services, then unfortunately the rules are completely different. Now, if you're selling digital products like downloads, then in that respect, and in their consumers, by the way, so your end customer is not VAT registered, your end customer is not VAT registered in the country they're located in the EU, and they consume digital products, so typically like a download, then the VAT is based on where your customer is located. Now, what does that mean? Now, I'll give you a general overview, and as I said, I've got a more detailed webinar coming out on this particular topic out next Friday at 2 p.m. I'll publish some details in the link after that. So if you are selling digital services or digital products, that's things like you might run a training company, you might have a bundle package where you're selling e-publications, you may be selling hosting services, you may be selling software. Effectively, they're all downloadable, they're all accessed through the internet or some other electronic communication device. If it's B2C sales, in that respect, what that says is you either have to register in the country for where your customer is located, irrespective, by the way, of how much you're selling, whether it's a one-off or a regular sale. And then you have to charge VAT at the rate resident in that particular country. There is a way to avoid that, something called MOS, which means you just register as a one-stop shop in a particular country. There are 27 to choose from. And therefore you just say, I'm selling to somebody in France, I charge the rate of French VAT, which I believe is currently 20%. I might have a customer that's based in Hungary where the rate is 27%. I work it out. I've got a customer in Luxembourg where the rate is 17%. I just do all that, do it as one single VAT return, file it in an appropriate country, one of the 27, end of story. Now, the last thing I want to mention here is what's called distance selling. Now, distance selling is where you have no interface between, effectively, it's not a face-to-face transaction. So you can be selling it like by mail order, perhaps. You could sell it by text, by phone, whatever. Well, in that situation, if you're selling goods on a B2C relationship, largely, then what's going to happen is there is no minimum, there is no light touch regime. So at the moment, if you're distance selling, the threshold for not having to register for EU VAT is between 35,000 and 100,000 euros on average. Different countries have their own, what they call minimum registration limits. So in the UK, if your taxable supplies are over 85 grand, you've got to register for VAT. In other European countries, they have either no limits or they have a threshold limit, which may differ to what the UK's is. Now, for distance selling, largely from the 1st of July 2021, there is no minimum threshold. there as well. So again, you need to make sure you either register in the country that you're selling into, or you register with one single designated country accordingly under what we call the MOS scheme. Just to complete this, by the way, if anybody's in a MOS scheme at the moment, just bear in mind, after effectively, I suppose realistically, midnight on the 31st of December 2020, UK MOS cannot be used for selling into the EU. So even if you have got MOS going on at the moment, which stands for mini one-stop shop, it will not apply to sales into the EU. So you've got to re-register with one of the 27 countries that are offering their services. Okay, folks, hope you found that useful. I'm going to publish a couple of links, as I said. So there's some bits and bobs. We've got a couple of blogs already out there on Brexit, the good, the bad, the ugly, or FAQs for want of a better term. We've got a blog and a podcast, believe it or not, called I Hate Numbers on VAT in a post-Brexit world, and effectively the audio version of what's happening with Brexit. We are going to be publishing more guidance over the next few days, few weeks. We've got a webinar coming out on Friday, which I'm excited about. It's gone through its trial run. So if you are a digital products business, you're selling digital products into the EU, or you plan to from the 1st of January 2021, remember, there's no light touch regime. So on the 1st of January, if you have a single download that's purchased, even for a modest amount of money, you've got to either register in that EU country, comply with all the VAT regulations, okay? It applies to you. There is no light touch anymore. Currently, it's €10,000. After the 31st of December, that's now waived completely. So if you're in that, then, you know, I'd love your company on that webinar next Friday. Failing that, everyone, have a fantastic Saturday. I hope you found that useful. Any questions, please chuck them into the chat box, and I'll pick them up accordingly. I'll add some links as well. So only suffices for me to say thanks for your company. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday, and I'll see you guys soon.